So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here this evening. So as Jean said, my work very much focuses on the mid-17th century, and I was one of the researchers on the 1641 depositions project with Annalee Margie, and I was also a researcher on the Oliver Cromwell writings and speeches project at the University of Cambridge under Professor John Morrell. So I kind of intersect a number of different points in the 1640s, and my own PhD research and wider research is about privateering and piracy in the 1640s, and I'm going to combine a number of these elements here tonight to shed some light on the 1640s and the period of the British Civil Wars in County Louth. What I'm going to say is my interests are very maritime, and I'm going to be very much focusing along the coast. So I'm going to be talking about Drogheda, Dundalk, Carlingford, and indeed Newry, which for the purposes of this evening becomes part of County Louth, whether Newry likes it or not. I'd also like to say that everywhere changes hands a lot. So there's going to be a period in the middle of the 1640s where I'm kind of going to ignore, and that's the period of the cessation in 1643 to 47, where it's not that things aren't happening, but from a coastal perspective, there's not really a lot happening. But to start at the beginning, on the 22nd of October 1641, a rebellion broke out in Ireland, and this rebellion had two strands. The first of these, and the one that's probably most interesting to us and the most well known, are the events in Ulster, when a rebellion led by Sir Phelim O'Neill is initially wildly successful. The rebels seize key fortifications. People like O'Neill managed to capture key garrisons like Charlemont. O'Neill gets into Charlemont under the pretense of going to dinner with the commander. So nobody expects this rebellion. It comes out of the blue in Ireland. So the Ulster Rebellion is very successful. But the plot to seize Dublin Castle fails. And Dublin Castle is vital because it's the key military stronghold in the country. It's where the government is, it's where all the administration is based, and it's also where all the arms and ammunition is based in this point in time. And what goes wrong there is very simple: alcohol. The rebels go out drinking on the night of the 22nd of October, and one of the head rebels talks to his foster brother, Owen Connolly, but Owen Connolly has converted to Protestantism, and he goes and he lets the justices, John Parsons in the castle, know. Essentially, he rats the plot out, and the key plotters are arrested. So when they try and rise up the next day, the government forces are waiting for them, and the plot fails disastrously. And this is crucial because what this means is that the government holds Dublin. They hold the city, they hold the garrison, and it means that this second key element of the plot fails. Now, the rebellion in Ulster sparks off something in Ireland, and it spreads very, very rapidly throughout the province, down into North Leinster, into Louth, and then around the rest of the country. So through the autumn and spring of 1642, the rebellion spreads really, really rapidly, and indeed very bloodily. A lot of massacres and atrocities are associated with this rebellion. And a key source for this rebellion, and something I've worked on extensively, are the 1641 depositions. So these are the depositions of people who were robbed, or as in the language of the time, the despoiled subject. So the Lord Justices in Dublin, once they realised what had happened, they decided they needed to find out what had happened, who'd been robbed, who'd been killed, who did the robbing and killing, and also why this had happened, what had happened, who'd been plotting, who had they been talking to. And so this commission is set up, and they take all of these depositions. And the depositions are held in Trinity College, Dublin, since 1741, and they've been digitised and transcribed. So you can read the transcriptions online at the 1641 depositions website. And what happens in Louth with this rebellion happens? Well, the rebellion spreads really quickly, as I said, from Ulster into North Leinster. Newry and Carlingford quickly fall to the rebels. Simply put, the soldiers who are there garrisoning this for government forces, there's not very many of them. They're poorly armed, and it's completely unexpected. By the time the news gets to them, these towns have already fallen. Dundalk falls a bit later on the 31st of October, and it's taken by the rebels. The garrison in Dundalk surrender or run away very quickly because they simply have virtually no ammunition. They know they can't fight back, and they're not stupid enough to try and stand. Then the Ulster rebels move south. They want to capture the very important town of Drogheda. But Drogheda has a bit more notice. As you can see, it's the 21st of November, nearly a month later. So the garrison in Drogheda have time to get supplies in to strengthen their forces, and Drogheda is a strong walled town in this period. So by the time the rebels get to Drogheda, they're not able to take it quickly. They have to besiege the town. Around this time as well, on the 4th of November, Phelim O'Neill and Rory Maguire, another leading rebel, and Newry, reveal a commission that they claim is from King Charles I in England. And this commission, the so-called False Commission, this is where they claim that actually Charles has given the rebels in Ireland permission for what they do, if anything, that they're fighting on behalf of King Charles. Now, we know this commission is a forgery. Modern scholarship disproves it completely. But at the time, people believed this. People believed that King Charles in England had genuinely given the rebels permission to do what they did. And this causes all sorts of problems, as we'll see later in the talk. So what about the depositions in County Louth? Well, actually, County Louth is the smallest county. It also has the smallest number of depositions. If you go to the website, their volume MS 834, and there are 204 folios in this volume. Louth is actually bound in with Monaghan, but only the first 47 folios, so that's just over 50 pages, relate to County Louth. And there's a number of reasons behind this, and I'll explain why. The first Louth deposition is dated in January 1642, and it belongs to a man called William Bellis from Carlingford. And in this deposition, Bellis tells us about how he was robbed. He lists his cattle, his household goods. He names a number of rebels, such as Peter Dargis from Omeath, who robbed him, and he talks about a number of people he knows locally who were killed. So this is the first of the Louth depositions. So you'll notice this gap between the rebellion starting in October, the commission to investigate in November. It's January before the first people from Louth are turning up in Dublin to give evidence. You don't give evidence where you live. If you're going to give evidence, have a deposition, you have to go to Dublin and you have to give your evidence in front of the Lord Justices there. We have a really interesting deposition by a woman called Elizabeth Harkin, and I've put her story on the screen here. Her husband, James, was a saddler in Dundalk, and she describes how they were robbed of goods and property worth £61 and 18 shillings. And she says this happens around the 1st of November 1641, which ties in with Dundalk falling at the end of October. And she blames a man called Thurlock O'Reilly. And she says that her husband then goes to fight against the rebel forces at Trim, and he's killed there. And Elizabeth gives evidence because she goes to Dublin. And she goes to Dublin because she finds herself forced out of the town of Dundalk. And she says how she was big with child, she was pregnant, and she flees with her mother, 6 more of her brethren and sisters to this city of Dublin, where now she and they live in penury, having nothing whereof to be maintained. And this is a problem that happens, especially to women, if their husbands are fighting in garrisons elsewhere or are killed, and they find themselves having to flee through the winter of 1641. This is one of the harshest winters ever recorded in Irish history. Nowadays, we talk about climate change. In the 17th century, there's what's often referred to by historians as a mini ice age. It was much, much colder than it was now. So in October 1641, there was snow on the ground. People froze to death trying to get to Dublin. There are stories of people dying in ditches because of the cold weather in this period. When you consider it how nice it was today, how balmy it is almost out. So something very, very different. So this was really, really hard. But Elizabeth and her family make it to Dublin, and this is why they're able to give evidence about what happened. And the problem with Louth in this period, why there's only 47 depositions, is very simple. Most people from Louth never go to Dublin. They stay in Louth, they stay where they are, which means they don't tell their story. We don't hear what happens to them. It's only people who flee who give an account. If you stay put, you won't be interviewed, you won't tell your side of the story. Louth is very close to Dublin, and as we'll see, the Louth garrisons either don't fall or are retaken quickly by government forces, which means people don't have to flee. You have huge numbers of depositions from Ulster, from Armagh and County Down, because people flee south. You have very few depositions from County Antrim up north, because in Antrim, you're unlikely to go to Dublin, you are going to cross the sea to Scotland, and again, your deposition won't survive in this collection. So geography plays a large part in who tells their story and whose story survives here. Some people give information quite late. So John Clark, a shoemaker from Dundalk, doesn't go to Dublin until September 1647. And then he tells what happened to him in Dundalk and events there around November 1641. And he tells the story of a massacre that took place in Dundalk one Sunday. And he notes that a number of Protestant refugees had fled to the town of Dundalk from Ulster. And he describes how men, women and children there perished at the river of Dundalk, being professed Protestants inhabitants, the number of 5 and 30, so 35, all driven by the inhabitants thereabouts where they were drowned. And massacres like this in rivers were actually quite common in 1641. The most well known is the massacre of Protestants at Portadown in the River Bann in November. But as you can see, again, a massacre, a similar one taking place in Dundalk. And this is why we get these images of massacres on bridges. Again, you force the people over, and then the soldiers on the shore. You use something to what the phrase at the time, it's not very nice, is knock the people on the head if they try and get out of the river, if they're able to swim. Of course, people often in woolen clothes at this period are going to struggle to swim to escape. So a massacre is taking place in Dundalk. It's quite bloody and violent here. There are a number of depositions from Louth in the 1650s as well. The 1650s depositions are the Cromwellian, the Commonwealth depositions, and actually most of the people who are in the Louth volume in 1650s actually aren't really from Louth. They're people who are imprisoned in the jail in Dundalk awaiting trial for crimes in the 1640s. So most of them are actually from Ulster rather than being from Louth. And some of them are petitioning, claiming they've been put in jail. They're wrong, that they were innocent, they'd nothing to do with the rebellion, like these petitioners here, and they claim they've been held in the jail in Dundalk for 8 months and endured a lamentable imprisonment, and they claim they're there because of malicious information that's been given against them. So when you read the Louth depositions, it's a very mixed bag. There's not actually that much information about Louth in them. Some depositions from other counties also have information about Louth, but unfortunately, Louth in the 1641 depositions, it's not as rich as there are 6 volumes about Cork. There are 2 volumes about Wexford. There's multiple volumes about Dublin. So you get a sense some counties have a huge amount of information. There was a commission operating in Cork, so we learn a lot about there. There's a commission in Dublin, so there's lots about Dublin. So it's slightly erratic what we do or don't learn. But what actually happens in Louth, and why is Louth so important? Well, as I told you, I'm a maritime historian. I'm interested in the coast and what happens on the coast. And coastal towns are vital in this period. If you hold a port town, you can resupply your army. You can lift a siege. If the besiegers are on land, you can get supplies in. You can use your army to reinforce, to go and campaign out from there. And the key problem the Ulster rebels face is in October, November, December, they push forward. They capture a lot of towns like Newry, Carlingford, because these towns are unaware. It's unexpected. But the Ulster rebels don't hold the towns. They lack the resources and the military skill at this stage of the war to hold on to the towns they've captured. And what this means is that essentially government forces can send soldiers into these towns to retake the country. So the failure of the rebels to take and keep places like Carrickfergus means that the Scots army that's sent to help the government forces can land an army there. In April 1642, the Scots Major General Robert Monroe lands 2,500 men in Carrickfergus, and he clears the area, including retakes Newry on the 1st of May. The Scots have an absolute brilliant plan to retake Carlingford. They realise that Carlingford's a tough nut to crack militarily. So what they do is they send a ship to Carlingford. It's described in this pamphlet. They describe it as Knockfergus landing there, where they land. And they put a Spanish flag on this ship. So when it sails into Carlingford, the rebels holding Carlingford think it's an ally. It's a Spanish ship coming to sell them guns and bring them ammunition because the Spanish are going to be allied with the Irish cause. Except it's not. A number of the garrison commanders, the officers, the rebel officers, row out to the Spanish, what they believe is the Spanish ship, and there they're captured. They're locked up in the hole below, and then the Scots land their soldiers, and of course the Irish rebels are now leaderless, at which point the town is quickly retaken, and the rebel soldiers in the castle basically run away. They realise that the game is up. They're not going to be able to hold out. So this ruse de guerre with the Spanish flag works beautifully to help the government forces retake Carlingford. So just to say a bit about the coastal towns of Drogheda, Dundalk, and indeed Carlingford. I'm not telling anybody in this room anything they actually don't know about the towns and the port towns, but I'd like to think about how people knew them at this point in time. So Drogheda and Dundalk offer really good anchorages for merchant ships. They're not going to be suitable as naval bases in this period. You're not going to put men of war in these port towns for any period of time. And this is because Drogheda and Dundalk have a number of natural obstacles that make them difficult. At Drogheda, there's a bar bar that can only be crossed at high tide. And this is Gerald Boat's 1657 description of Drogheda. He describes the haven of very troublesome to be got into, a bar across the mouth of the river, and you can only pass at high water. Dundalk is described as being a very wide open bay, but it lacks deep water and shelter for the ships from the wind. And again, you can see Boat's description here about the problem, about how you can't really anchor ships in Dundalk for any length of time. So you can get ships into both towns with supplies to relieve the garrisons. You can land soldiers there, but you're not going to station ships there for very long. Carlingford, on the other hand, is the best natural harbour indeed in the region, and Gerald Boat would actually suggest on the east coast of Ireland. It's deep, it's sheltered, it can be fortified. In 1646, a blockhouse, so a blockhouse is a shore level defensive feature with cannon in it. The Confederate government said it would cost about £180, 3 shillings and 8 pence to fortify Carlingford Harbour. But the problem with Carlingford is twofold. Firstly, there are a number of rocks which make it difficult to enter the harbour if you don't know what you're doing. But actually, the greater problem with Carlingford is actually Carlingford's not important. It's far too far away from anywhere. And indeed, Gerald Boat, again, describing this in 1657, talks about it as, you know, a fair large harbour, being everywhere very deep. So as the biggest ships may come to anchor, but he says it's a very poor place, hardly worth speaking of. So essentially what we've got is the best natural harbour on the east coast, but the town is irrelevant. And you've got two other good coastal towns in Louth. And this is why Louth remains so important through the 1640s. This is actually why we're going to have Cromwell at Drogheda, as we'll see. But what happens in Louth and these sieges? Well, on the 21st of November, as I said, the Ulster rebels come before Drogheda and they besiege the town. The Dublin garrison, commanded by the royalists, send a relief force, and this relief force marches overland. But the soldiers in this relief force are really, really inexperienced. They don't know what they're doing, and the rebels attack them and defeat them on the 29th of November at Julianstown. And this creates a problem for the government in Dublin. What are we going to do? How are you going to relieve Drogheda? Drogheda is too close to Dublin. It's dangerous if it falls. The problem for the Ulster rebels is they lack the artillery and military supplies to storm Drogheda. To get into Drogheda, you need to blast a hole in the walls and storm through. They don't have the gunpowder to do that. They don't have the cannon to do that. So the plan is to really have a close blockade, essentially to close off access to the sea, to close off land access to Drogheda, and to starve the garrison into submission, to basically force the food to run out and to force the civilians and soldiers defending Drogheda to surrender. Now, the government in Dublin realises this, and the government in Dublin has one great advantage, and that great advantage is ships. There's actually quite a lot of ships in Dublin at the outbreak of the rebellion, and the government takes control of all of them and commandeers them and says, you are now our naval force. And they have two naval ships there as well, one commanded by a man called Thomas Bartlett, and he's quite a good naval commander. So the government is lucky and it decides, right, well, we can't get forces through over land. This is too dangerous. The rebels control all the land. We will send supplies in over sea. Of course, the sandbar at Drogheda is going to be on the Boyne, is going to make this difficult. It's going to be impassable at low tide. So you think actually here the Ulster rebels should have a real advantage. They've Drogheda closed off by land, and the harbour, the port, the town is difficult to get into. It's difficult to get up the Boyne. So, you know, actually it should be easy enough, or so you would think, to force Drogheda to surrender. The rebels, this is a story of incompetence, bad luck, and of course, if you're a 17th century Protestant, God's will, God's providence. The rebels try and obstruct the channel by sinking a bark, a small ship in it. This doesn't work. A storm breaks the ship up and drives it out to sea. So then they try something a bit stronger, a boom. So essentially a boom is logs and chains that you put across the bar and use two ships at either end to hold it in place. So essentially the two ships are going to be manned so you can fire on anybody trying to come in. This boom proved to be wildly ineffective, so ineffective that government forces sailed a pinnace and a shallop. So these are two relief ships carrying supplies over the boom on the 12th of January. The rebels decide, okay, we'll strengthen our boom, we'll make it stronger, we add more chains. Again, in late February, it proves ineffective, and the government forces managed to sail 12 relief ships up over this boom into Drogheda. So you can see this is real incompetence. It should have been quite straightforward to put a boom there to prevent anybody getting in. And essentially, after February, once the 12 ships get in, the rebels lose heart. What's the point of besieging this place if the government can just keep sending supplies in? We're never going to starve them out. And you can see this news book here, Approved Good and Joyful News from Ireland. And it talks about we had knowledge that our ships sent with victuals to relieve Drogheda had got safely in and in sight of the enemy who had chained up the harbour, but our men broke the chain and got in notwithstanding. And public thanks was with us for this happiness. Such a great strait was the city, they're referring to Drogheda as a city, as to eat horse flesh. So, of course, the poor people of Drogheda had been reduced to nearly starvation. They were eating horse flesh, but they got supplies in. And indeed, another account of the siege, the victorious proceedings of the Protestants in Ireland, with this beautiful illustration, as you can see here on the screen, talks about how the sailors had brought instruments to break the chain, but they did not need them because God delivered a wind and tide to break the chain before our ships. It also noted the great misery of the inhabitants in Drogheda. As I've said, they were reduced to eating horse flesh, and that the soldiers who were in the garrison were going round breaking into the inhabitants' houses and stealing from them because they were unpaid, and they were selling the goods off for a fraction of their worth. And I love this quote in this pamphlet, and it talks about the misery of war. But sure, none knows the misery of war but those that see it, and sure, none will desire it. Still very resonant today as it was in 1642. And then, of course, with the rebels' siege petering out at Drogheda, the rebel forces are not very strong in Louth, and government forces under Henry Tichborne managed to retake Dundalk in March 1642. So now we have a scenario where essentially the key garrisons of Louth, Dundalk, Drogheda, Carlingford and Newry have now been taken back by the government. The Ulster rebels, they weren't able to hold their early gains. They've had to retire back into Ulster. And what we see happening now is over the spring and summer of 1642, we move into a different phase of the war. The Ulster rebels, the Irish rebels, form together and they form a new government based with the Parliament at Kilkenny, headquartered in Kilkenny, the Confederate Catholic Association, with its oath of association with a new government. Despite all of these events happening in Kilkenny, Dundalk, Drogheda remain in the hands of the Dublin government, and this is going to continue for quite a while. And then in September 1643, the government in Dublin, the royalist government, makes peace, a cessation with the Confederate Catholic Association. So the royalists hold what they have, the garrisons in Louth, the Confederates hold what they have, most of the rest of the country. For the next 4 years, there's a semi-peace in operation. It's never full peace, but it's semi-peace. With that in mind, I'm going to jump ahead shamelessly to 1647 because I'm mainly looking at military events here. And what happens in 1647 is everything changes, and everything changes because King Charles I has lost the civil war in England. By 1646, the king has been defeated militarily, politically. He's a prisoner. He's not going to win. Ultimately, we know he'll die. He'll be executed, but we don't know that at this point in time. And what this means in Dublin is that the Marquis of Ormond, the royalist Lord Lieutenant, now finds his position untenable. He has no political support in England because the king's been defeated. He's short supplies and money, and he can't hold his garrisons anymore. The parliamentarians who have defeated the king in England send a naval force to blockade Dublin, and essentially Ormond's position is hopeless. And so he negotiates a surrender agreement in 1647 with the parliamentarians, and he agrees to hand over his garrisons. And his garrisons are Dublin, but they're also Drogheda, Dundalk, Newry, Narrowwater, Carlingford and Greencastle. So these towns places like Drogheda, which have been royalists, who have been loyal to the government all along, are now handed over. They're exchanged to Parliament. They don't fall militarily, they're just handed over. And in August 1647, Colonel Michael Jones, parliamentarian commander, takes command of Dublin and these other garrisons, and the Marquis of Ormond, the great royalist leader of the 1640s, goes into exile. Except there's a second civil war. And in the spring summer of 1648, the Marquis of Ormond returns to Ireland and he goes to Cork this time. And so now we have a really complex set of exchanges and changes of sides. And what happens is, because so many people in Ireland are annoyed with the parliamentarians, are hacked off with how they're treating the king, how the army in particular, men like Oliver Cromwell, Thomas Fairfax, are treating the king, how they're talking about putting King Charles I on trial. A number of people in Ireland who had supported Parliament before find themselves annoyed with Parliament, unwilling to support it anymore. And Ormond now finds himself able to bring together different sides in Ireland to support a royalist cause, to join together. In Munster, he wins over a man called Lord Inchiquin, Murrogh O'Brien. Now, Murrogh O'Brien, depending on your perspective, is one of the great evils of the 1640s. He initially, his family would be great Catholic O'Briens of Munster, but he's raised as a Protestant. In the 1640s, he initially is supporting the royalist cause, but in 1644, he feels he's slighted by King Charles I, and he becomes a parliamentarian. And between 1644 and 1647, he leads an exceedingly brutal campaign in Munster. In 1644, he expels all the Catholics from the town of Cork. In 1647, he storms and kills everybody at the Rock of Cashel. So Inchiquin is notorious. He's known as Murrogh of the Burnings, so incredibly well known for his brutality. But by 1648, he is annoyed with Parliament in England. He's offended by them at a number of levels, and he is willing to go back to the royalist cause. Now, a number of people don't like Inchiquin because of this, and it's difficult. This is a man who changes sides far too often. His motivations are quite complex, and you can never trust what he says his motivations are. But he goes back to the royalist cause. And Ormond also persuades the Confederates, the former rebels, most of them, to join forces, and simply says, actually, you know what? The great evil is not each other. The great evil are the parliamentarians. We need to come together and fight them. And indeed, a number of the Scots forces in Ireland who are in Ulster will also join this royalist coalition. The problem is not everybody likes this coalition. The clergy, the clerical faction, do not like the fact that the Royalists and the Confederates are making a peace, a deal with Murrogh O'Brien, Inchiquin. He is the great evil. He is not trustworthy. This man changes sides at the drop of a hat. So a number of people are appalled at this. Indeed, people like the papal nuncio Rinuccini say, actually, what we should do is we should all get together and we should attack and wipe him out. The Ulster Confederates, led by Owen Roe O'Neill, side with the clerical faction. They are opposed to a peace deal with somebody they regard as an apostate and a traitor like Inchiquin. They see this peace, the Inchiquin truce and the Ormond cessations, as in very bad taste, that Inchiquin cannot be trusted, that he will turn his back on them. And they don't support the coalition. So now we have a problem, and this is the classic problem of Ireland in the 1640s. There are too many sides fighting against each other. James Scott Wheeler's written a great essay, and it's called Four Armies in Ireland. And this is the problem, that nobody actually unites. Everybody's always factionalized. And this creates a number of interesting problems. And this problem is, we now have a scenario where we have the Ulster Confederates, very, very Catholic, led by Owen Roe O'Neill. And they're going to form an alliance with the Protestant parliamentarians based in Dundalk, which is absolutely crazy at many, many levels. These people should be natural enemies. Because what happens is, in January 1649, King Charles I is executed in London by Parliament. And virtually everybody else in Ireland decides that actually, you know what, it doesn't matter what else we thought. The great evil is Parliament. We are now going to get behind King Charles II, Charles I's son, and we are going to fight for him. This leaves virtually the only people opposed to the Royalists in Ireland in the garrisons of Dublin, Dundalk, Drogheda and Newry, and the garrisons held by Owen Roe O'Neill. The Scots in Ulster actually realised their true loyalty to the Stuart monarchy, so they support King Charles II by and large. Most of the other Confederates say, yeah, you know what, we're going to fight for the Royalists. We're all going to fight with Ormond. We're going to have a good Royalist coalition. And that's what you need to get the parliamentarians out of Ireland. Except Colonel George Monk finds himself commanding a very small garrison of parliamentarian soldiers in Dundalk. And he realizes now, with this royalist coalition all around the country, he's incredibly vulnerable. He's short supplies and nobody's going to send supplies to him. And you'll notice before I said it's about Dundalk is vulnerable to Ulster. So Carlingford fell to the Scots forces from Carrickfergus. Newry fell to the Scots from Carrickfergus. So basically, Monk knows that actually, if the Scots move down the east coast, Dundalk is going to fall to them. So what does Monk do? He begins one of the most baffling series of negotiations in Irish history. As historians, we still can't peel all of this apart. But he begins negotiations between the parliamentarian forces, these staunch Protestants, fundamentally opposed to Catholicism and Irish Catholics. And he begins negotiations with the most Catholic army in Ireland under Owen Roe O'Neill. And they agree a cessation. Now, for Monk believes this is a temporary expedient. Monk's plan is actually quite simple. He knows that Oliver Cromwell is coming. The dogs in the street know Oliver Cromwell is coming. You can't hide Oliver Cromwell's invasion force. It's humongous. It's in Milford Haven. Everybody knows it's coming. And Monk understands that what he needs to do is hold on for as long as possible. So Monk is telling people like Michael Jones in Dublin, he's communicating with Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is fully aware that this deal is going on. He is not like, he will deny it later and he will say, no, I don't approve of that. But these guys all know this is going on because what they need more than anything else in the spring of 1649, in the summer of 1649, is they need to hold that corridor on the east coast. They need to hold Dublin and ideally Drogheda and Dundalk, because that's going to give them a landing base. Because remember, virtually everywhere else is under royalist control. Cork would have been a brilliant place to land, but Inchiquin's defected to the royalists. Of course, the garrisons in Cork will later defect back to Parliament, but as I said, everybody keeps changing sides here. So what Monk is told by the parliaments and by Michael Jones is to do your utmost to preserving things in as good a state as you can till these forces arrive. So essentially hold out until Cromwell arrives. Make whatever deal you can, even if it's unpalatable to deal with Irish Catholic rebels in Ulster. And that's how Parliament views these men. These guys are the people who started the rebellion in 1641. But the Cromwellian parliamentarians will make a deal with them because that's the best option. And on the 8th of May, 1649, they signed this deal. Now, the reality of the deal that Monk makes with Owen Roe O'Neill, actually, Parliament are unhappy with this. They said you should make a deal. They're not quite happy with the deal he makes. Monk justifies himself to Cromwell, noting that he was in a very ill condition. So he's not saying he was sick physically himself. He's saying basically, I can barely hold on in Dundalk. And one of the things he promises Owen Roe O'Neill and the Ulster Confederate Army is ammunition. O'Neill's men are desperately short of gunpowder and munitions. And so in exchange for the Ulster Army promising to defend Dundalk, Monk promises to give them ammunition. And Monk basically says, this is the only way I can hold out. This is the only chance I have to hold on until you get there. So as you can imagine, this is deals with the devil on both sides. It doesn't matter how you look at this. So what happens? Well, then in July 1649, the royalist forces finally make a move on Dublin. Ormond and Inchiquin understand that the key is to take Dublin out of the equation. If you remove Dublin, then where will Cromwell land? He has nowhere to land. He has no safe haven. As they advance on Dublin, Ormond decides that the best thing he can do is he sends Inchiquin up with his cavalry north to take Drogheda and Dundalk. Drogheda gives up really quickly on the 11th of July. It doesn't even make a serious attempt to hold out. Monk in Dundalk, however, has other options. And he writes to O'Neill and says, hey, we made a deal, send me men to help me, and I'll give your men ammunition. And O'Neill sends his lieutenant general, a man called O'Farrell, to collect the munitions. And this goes wrong because when they get to Dundalk to collect the ammunition, O'Farrell's soldiers stay drinking. Dundalk's always a good town for going out in, and they become drunk, and Inchiquin's cavalry come upon them, and essentially they abandon the ammunition and they withdrew. And this leaves Monk massively exposed and incredibly vulnerable because he's supposed to have the arms are supposed to be with the Irish soldiers, and they're supposed to help protect him from Inchiquin. And essentially what happens is, even though he'd made this deal, Monk's soldiers force him to surrender. They refuse to fight. They simply say, this is a hopeless position. Without the Irish army to bolster us, we can't hold on, and they surrender. Not long afterwards, on the 2nd of August 1649, the royalist forces are defeated at the Battle of Rathmines by the parliamentarians under Michael Jones. And on the 15th of August, Oliver Cromwell lands in Ireland, and all changes. Ormond's initial plan is quite simple. Ormond believes, and he's not wrong in this actually, he believes that the key to defeating Cromwell is to drag the war out as long as possible. General winter and disease will decimate the parliamentarian army. Traditionally, English armies, when they land in Ireland, are destroyed by disease, campaigning, diseases like the bloody flux, dysentery. They're not used to the country. And essentially, you will hope that gradually over time, they will die. Cromwell brings close to 12,000 men, and these are battle-hardened soldiers. So essentially, the plan is to drag the war out, waste Cromwell's army down. So Ormond's plan, and Ormond, to be fair, is not very good as a general, probably why he lost at Rathmines, is essentially to drag the war out and to use garrisons. And there's a sense, and it's a false sense, that Drogheda is somewhat impregnable. The problem with Drogheda, of course, is it held out in 1641, but the rebels in 1641 were borderline incompetent and not very well armed. In 1649, Oliver Cromwell is incredibly competent and incredibly well supplied and armed. Arthur Aston, the great English royalist commander, very experienced, very skilled soldier, is appointed as governor as Drogheda, but he only has about 3,000 men and he lacks arms and ammunition. Cromwell is close to 12,000 men, though granted he doesn't bring all of them with him. Cromwell uses the sea to transport his munitions up to Drogheda. Again, sea power matters here because everybody's thinking, well, Cromwell's such a huge army. It's going to take him a while to get to Drogheda to move all of these cannon. It's going to be slow. Actually, no, Cromwell much, much quicker. So the town is not properly prepared. Attempts to negotiate the surrender of the town come to nothing, and the parliamentarians begin to batter Drogheda in September 1649. Initially, the town's defences hold off, but Cromwell simply has too much artillery. He has too many men. And eventually they batter a hole and his men are able to force their way into the town. And in the fighting that follows, it's incredibly brutal. And Cromwell's soldiers slaughter most of the garrison of Drogheda. All of the quotes I have on the screen going forward are from Oliver Cromwell. These are Cromwell's own words, what he himself said of Drogheda. And he describes how initially the garrison made a stout resistance and that a number of the royalist soldiers in Drogheda, they went to high places, towers and Millmount to try and hold out. So as you can imagine the walls, the Cromwellian soldiers streaming through these breaches, more and more soldiers pouring and fanning out into the streets. It's chaos. Nobody's really fully in control at this point in time, though Cromwell will claim to be. And Cromwell describes how at Millmount, the governor, Arthur Aston, with divers considerable officers being there, our men getting up to them, were ordered by me to put them all to the sword. So put them all to the sword means kill everybody. And indeed, being in the heat of the action, I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town. So this is Cromwell saying he gave the order for no quarter, no prisoners in the heat of the action. Arthur Aston is reputedly beaten to death with his wooden leg because the parliamentarian soldiers have heard the story that this is where he hid his gold coins. Actually, Arthur Aston had quite a bit of wealth on him, but it was in a money belt around his waist, not hidden in his wooden leg. At St. Peter's Church, again, where a number of the soldiers have gone to hide and they've gone up the tower, Cromwell describes how he ordered the steeple to be fired, to be burnt, and then he heard one of the defenders cry out in the midst of the flames, God damn me, God confound me, I burn, I burn. I kind of think you get a sense of Cromwell almost having glee with this in some levels. At another tower, he describes when they submitted, their officers were knocked on the head. Again, you knock somebody on the head to kill them, and every 10th man of the soldiers killed, and the rest shipped for Barbados. So he decimates the men who surrender. Decimating them like that, only killing 1 in 10 is actually considered very generous. This is considered good terms in the 17th century. And of course, sending the rest as prisoners of war to be indentured servants, slaves, essentially in Barbados. And again, this is what Cromwell does time and time again. After the Battle of Dunbar in Scotland, again, the prisoners that survive are shipped to Barbados. Part of the reason Cromwell also storms at Drogheda, as I said, is because of the role of the Navy. And actually the sailors get in on the action. So a Captain Brandley with 40 sailors, or 40 or 50 sailors, actually takes part in the storming. So the sailors actually come on shore to help the soldiers, to reinforce them and to really push through. And again, the sailors are very experienced using cannon, and this is often what they use them for. So you can hear how Cromwell describes what happens in the town of Drogheda here. It's clearly absolute carnage, a lot of slaughter. And the fact that his actions at Millmount say, you know, I forbade to spare any, feeds through to his soldiers this sense of slaughtering whoever you find. Now, Cromwell tries to justify his actions at the siege. And again, he writes down what he happens, and he describes how, I believe we put to the sword the whole number of defendants. I do not think 30 of the whole number escaped with their lives. So of the 3,000 men in the garrison, he suggests that most of them were killed, and he actually lists out details in his account of some of the men who died. And he tries to justify his actions, and this is really, really interesting what he says, or indeed doesn't say, is because how he tries to justify his actions is he says, I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands with so much innocent blood, and that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future. So these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood. He's talking about the Ulster Rebellion of 1641 there, what the Ulster rebels did. But as I've said, Drogheda was never a rebel town. The rebels never took Drogheda. Drogheda was always a government town. It was surrendered in 1647 to Parliament, but it was never held by the rebels. The people in Drogheda were never in rebellion, but yet the garrison there and the soldiers there and the people in the town will be killed and blamed for the rebellion because, of course, this is Cromwell's perception. It suits him. But also Cromwell has this idea that if you act harshly at the beginning, well, then it will prevent the effusion of blood for the future. And this is the idea that if you act now, this will persuade other Irish garrisons to surrender. And he says this here, this has been a marvellous great mercy, and I believe this bitterness will save much effusion of blood through the goodness of God. So he repeats this phrase, and it's about persuading other towns to surrender quickly on the basis of you don't want to face what happens at Drogheda, do you? You realise actually better surrender quickly or we will be massacred as well. And initially that works because Cromwell writes to the governor of Dundalk the day after Drogheda, and he basically warns him to surrender, and he blames the people of Drogheda, and he says, for they brought their evil upon themselves. So essentially warning them, surrender or this will come to you quickly. And actually this works in and around North Louth, Meath, Ulster, and essentially a number of the garrisons that are royalists surrender quite quickly. On the 16th of September, Cromwell writes to the Council of State in London saying, the enemy quitted to us Trim and Dundalk. Essentially, the royalists in these towns realise, hang on, there's no point holding out. We don't have enough men, and we've just seen what happened at Drogheda. Remember, the perception is that Drogheda was a well-defended garrison, so everybody can't believe this is absolutely stunning. So they're like, hang on a minute, we'd better not hold out. Cromwell himself never goes further north than Drogheda. That's as far north as he goes. And he doesn't come to Dundalk. He just rides to Dundalk and basically says, surrender or else. But he sends an expedition under one of his best commanders, Colonel Robert Venables, to capture the town of Carlingford. And this is a really interesting joint operation with the Navy. And they send a Captain Ferns in the President frigate. The picture on the screen is what a 17th century frigate would have looked like, though it's not the President. It's one from a similar time period called the Assurance. And they launch a simultaneous land and sea attack on the town. And Ferns writes about how on the signal agreed between us came in with much gallantry and resolution. And the President, the ship comes under heavy fire from that blockhouse that was built in 1646. And indeed, one of the shots from the blockhouse takes off the mast of the ship before the garrison surrenders. And they capture a Wexford frigate there and a large store of munitions. So actually, Carlingford was able able to put up a decent level of resistance. And indeed, Cromwell praises Captain Fern, noting the captain's entrance to that harbour was a considerable adventure and a good service. And then Venables moves on to Newry, which again realises the game is up. There's no point holding out, and quite quickly surrenders. So again, Carlingford was a harder nut to crack than Dundalk in this period, as you can see. Though interestingly, they at least had to fight their way into Carlingford in this period, as opposed to in 1642, when a false flag did the trick. And that's kind of really the end, in many respects, of the campaign in Louth. There'll be other events, there'll be other small towns, but essentially, after this point in time, the royalist garrisons in Louth by and large surrender. Cromwell had hoped to spare much effusion of blood. The reality is, of course, he marches south to Wexford, where there is another incredibly brutal siege, and indeed then on to Waterford, which refuses to surrender. Cromwell's hard line at Drogheda probably persuaded other royalist garrisons that it was better to hold out and fight. Ultimately, Clonmel is one of the only places that truly holds out against him. And disease, as Ormond predicted, did a lot of damage. By the time we get into the winter of 1649 and the spring of 1650, Cromwell's army is decimated by disease in a very, very bad condition. Cromwell will ultimately leave Ireland in May 1650, so he's only in the country for about 9 months. But he's remembered today for his actions, the brutality in particular at Drogheda, and it continues to cause controversy and discussion among historians about what happened, what Cromwell meant, how should we take his words, and what happened there. But hopefully I've shown you some of the events that have happened in Louth in the 1640s and moved it a bit beyond the story just of Drogheda in 1649, which I think annoyed me is not the right word, but I think it dominates the stories. And actually, the siege of Drogheda in 1641, or the way places like Dundalk and Carlingford change hands, are quite interesting too. And I think you also see the importance of coastal history, thinking about the sea in relation to these towns. It's too easy to just look at military events on land. And I think we miss some really interesting dimensions of what happened in Louth if we take the sea out of the equation. So thank you very much for listening, and it's been my pleasure to speak here this evening, and I'm more than happy to take some questions.